378 passengers thought she was just another pilot. But when their plane began falling from the sky and F-22 fighters scrambled, one word changed everything: Ghost Rider. The most feared call sign in naval aviation had just revealed itself: flying a passenger jet. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. The woman flying 378 passengers across the country at 39,000 feet had once executed a stealth insertion into hostile airspace that military historians would classify for the next 50 years, but her first officer that morning thought she was just another pilot who had worked her way up through regional carriers flying commuter routes. Captain Sarah Mitchell adjusted the autopilot settings on the Boeing 777 and watched the morning sun paint golden streaks across the cloud layer below, thinking how strange it was that the passengers behind her sipping coffee and watching movies had no idea the hands on the controls had once guided a fighter jet through anti-aircraft fire so intense it looked like a wall of light, or that the calm voice making announcements about expected arrival times had once coordinated a combat extraction. That saved 23 lives while her aircraft was literally falling apart around her. She had been flying for Transcontinental Airlines for 7 years now, building a reputation as a solid, dependable captain who always arrived on time, handled turbulence smoothly, and maintained perfect safety records that made airline management happy but never drew special attention. Her colleagues at the airline knew her as someone who had done her training at a civilian flight academy in Arizona, worked her way through regional carriers flying smaller jets between secondary cities, accumulated the required flight hours through standard progression, and eventually earned her captain position through the same pathway that thousands of other commercial pilots followed every year. The other pilots respected her skills during difficult crosswind landings and her calm demeanor during weather delays, but they saw nothing exceptional about her background, nothing that would suggest she possessed training that went far beyond anything taught in civilian aviation programs. Her file with the airline showed a straightforward career progression with no gaps, no irregularities, and certainly no indication that she had once been one of the most feared and respected pilots in naval aviation, someone whose call sign made experienced fighter pilots sit up straighter and pay attention. The truth was that Sarah Mitchell had spent 12 years flying F/A-18 Super Hornets off aircraft carriers, executing missions in some of the most dangerous airspace on the planet, and earning a reputation that spread through military aviation communities like a legend that pilots whispered about in ready rooms. Her call sign, Ghost Rider, had not been given lightly or chosen casually like some call signs that came from jokes or embarrassing incidents during training. She had earned it during her third combat deployment when she had executed a night mission so perfectly timed and precisely flown that enemy radar operators never detected her approach, never saw her weapons release, and never understood how their heavily defended installation had been destroyed until long after she had disappeared back into the darkness. The name had stuck because she had repeated that performance over and over, appearing from nowhere to complete impossible missions and vanishing before anyone could track her, flying with an instinctive understanding of stealth tactics and combat maneuvering that seemed almost supernatural to the pilots who flew with her. Her military record was filled with classified operations that even she could not discuss, missions that had required split-second decisions under conditions that would have overwhelmed most pilots, situations where the margin between success and catastrophic failure was measured in fractions of a second and tiny adjustments of the flight controls. She had flown through thunderstorms that tore other aircraft apart, executed aerial refueling in turbulence that made tanker crews refuse to service other fighters, and brought damaged aircraft back to carriers when every systems indicator said she should eject and let the jet crash into the ocean. The younger pilots who flew with her had treated her with a mixture of awe and disbelief, unable to fully comprehend how someone could remain so calm while doing things that seemed impossible, how she could see solutions to tactical problems that no one else recognized, and how she consistently survived situations that should have been fatal. But Sarah had walked away from that life 7 years ago for reasons she never discussed with anyone at the airline. The classified nature of her final mission meant she could never explain what had happened or why she had decided that flying passengers between cities was preferable to the constant stress of combat operations where one mistake meant death. The military had helped her transition to civilian aviation by ensuring her records showed only the basic facts needed for commercial pilot certification, scrubbing away any mention of her call sign or the specific operations she had flown, creating a background that looked completely ordinary to anyone who checked. She had wanted anonymity, wanted to fly without the weight of expectations and reputation that came with being Ghost Rider, wanted morning flights where the biggest challenge was coordinating with air traffic control rather than evading surface-to-air missiles. Her first officer that morning was a friendly young man named Kevin who had been flying commercially for 5 years and chatted easily about his plans to upgrade to captain soon. He treated Sarah with professional respect but clearly saw her as a peer who happened to have more experience and seniority, someone who had followed the same career path he was following but had started earlier. When she had suggested a slight route adjustment to avoid some buildups that weather radar was showing ahead, he had readily agreed, impressed by her eye for weather patterns but attributing it to years of experience reading radar displays rather than the combat-honed ability to assess threat environments and find the safest path through danger. The flight attendants had checked in with their standard reports about passenger needs and cabin status, treating her as they treated every captain, never imagining that the woman in the left seat had once commanded respect from some of the most elite pilots in the military. The passengers behind her were doing what passengers always did on early morning transcontinental flights. Business travelers were working on laptops, families with children were trying to keep the kids entertained with tablets and games, elderly couples were reading books or sleeping, and solo travelers were watching movies or listening to music through headphones. None of them had looked at Captain Mitchell during boarding and thought she was anything other than a standard airline pilot who would get them safely to their destination. They trusted her competence in the same way they trusted that the wings would stay attached and the engines would keep running, assuming she had learned her skills through normal training and would handle any problems using standard procedures that all commercial pilots learned. Everything about that morning flight seemed completely routine as they crossed into the third hour of the 5-hour journey from Los Angeles to New York. Sarah was reviewing the fuel calculations and thinking about the approach procedures for JFK when the first indication of trouble came through the radio in a way that made her instincts sharpen immediately even though Kevin beside her showed no reaction. Air traffic control was directing several aircraft to alter their flight paths due to an unspecified situation, using language that seemed normal to civilian pilots but contained subtle indicators that Sarah recognized from her military background. The controller's voice had a slight tension that most people would miss, and the specific frequencies and altitudes being assigned suggested something more serious than routine traffic management. She was reaching to ask the controller for clarification when Kevin suddenly slumped forward against his harness, his hands dropping from the controls and his head lolling to the side. Sarah's response was immediate and automatic, trained reflexes taking over before conscious thought could process what was happening. She disconnected the autopilot and took manual control of the aircraft while simultaneously keying the intercom to call the senior flight attendant, her voice calm and professional even as her mind was already running through emergency procedures and assessing the situation. The senior flight attendant responded immediately, and Sarah instructed her to check if there were any medical professionals on board while she dealt with Kevin's incapacitation. But even as she was handling the immediate crisis of a first officer who had apparently suffered some kind of medical emergency, Sarah's trained instincts were telling her something was wrong beyond just Kevin's collapse. The timing was too coincidental, happening just as air traffic control was maneuvering aircraft in unusual patterns. She glanced at the aircraft system's displays and saw nothing obviously wrong, but her combat experience had taught her to trust her instincts even when instruments said everything was normal. She checked the cabin pressure indicators and saw they were reading normal, but something about the numbers made her pause. The cabin altitude was creeping upward slowly, so slowly that the rate of change was almost imperceptible, but it was moving in the wrong direction. Sarah made an immediate decision that would have seemed like overreaction to a civilian pilot but was second nature to someone with her combat background. She put on her oxygen mask and switched to 100% oxygen, then tried to get Kevin to respond so she could get a mask on him. He was breathing but unconscious, and when she managed to position the oxygen mask over his face, he showed no improvement. She called the senior flight attendant again and asked if anyone else in the cabin was feeling unwell or showing symptoms of distress. The response confirmed her worst fears when the flight attendant reported that several passengers in different sections of the cabin were complaining of headaches and dizziness, and one person had passed out. The cabin pressure system was failing in a way that was subtle enough to avoid triggering automatic warning systems but serious enough to cause hypoxia symptoms throughout the aircraft. Sarah immediately began an emergency descent, not waiting for clearance from air traffic control because every second at high altitude was causing more people to lose consciousness. She broadcast an emergency call on the radio, declaring a medical emergency and informing the controller that she was descending immediately to 10,000 feet where the ambient pressure would be safe even if the cabin pressurization failed completely. The controller acknowledged her emergency and cleared other traffic from her path, but there was something in his tone that suggested he was dealing with more than just her situation. As Sarah brought the massive 777 down through the flight levels in a controlled but aggressive descent that had passengers who were still conscious gripping their armrests in alarm, she heard radio traffic that made her blood run cold. The controller was coordinating with military frequencies, using terminology that indicated multiple aircraft were experiencing similar problems, and there was discussion of possible deliberate interference or sabotage. The word hostile came through the radio in a context that suggested this was not just mechanical failure but potentially an active threat situation. Sarah's mind immediately shifted into combat mode, assessing the tactical situation even as she continued to fly the descent profile that would get her passengers to a safe altitude. She leveled off at 10,000 feet and checked on Kevin, who was starting to show signs of regaining consciousness with the oxygen mask on and the higher pressure at the lower altitude. The flight attendants reported that the passengers who had been affected were recovering now that the aircraft was lower, though several would need medical attention on landing. Sarah was coordinating with air traffic control about diverting to the nearest suitable airport when she heard something on the radio that she had not heard in 7 years and had never expected to hear again in civilian airspace. A military controller was coordinating fighter intercepts using tactical call signs and procedures, and through the crosstalk between different frequencies, she heard the distinctive sound of F-22 Raptor pilots checking in with their controller. The situation was escalating in ways that most commercial pilots would not fully understand, but Sarah's combat background gave her immediate comprehension of what was happening. Multiple aircraft experiencing pressurization problems simultaneously, military fighters being scrambled, and the specific coordination procedures being used all indicated that someone had figured out how to interfere with aircraft systems, possibly through cyber attack or electronic warfare methods, turning commercial airliners into potential weapons or hostages. The authorities were treating this as a potential terrorist attack or hostile action that required military response, which meant F-22 stealth fighters had been launched to identify and potentially intercept any aircraft that might be under hostile control. Sarah made a rapid decision based on her assessment of the tactical situation and her understanding of how military pilots would be approaching this crisis. She knew that from the perspective of the F-22 pilots, her aircraft was potentially compromised and might be under hostile control, especially since she had declared an emergency and deviated from her assigned flight path. She needed to establish her credentials and let the military controllers know that her aircraft was under the command of a competent pilot who understood tactical procedures and could be trusted to follow instructions. But doing so would mean revealing the background she had kept hidden for 7 years and using the call sign she had left behind when she walked away from military aviation. She switched to the military coordination frequency that she could hear being used in the background of other transmissions, a frequency that civilian pilots normally never monitored and would not know existed. Her voice when she spoke was different from the professional but friendly tone she used with commercial air traffic control, carrying instead the crisp precision and tactical confidence that came from years of combat operations. She identified her aircraft by its civilian registration and flight number but then added words that she knew would immediately change how the military controllers and F-22 pilots perceived her situation. She said she was declaring the aircraft secure under command authority and that she was executing tactical diversion procedures to the nearest military-capable field for emergency assessment and response. The military controller's response showed immediate recognition that someone on her aircraft understood military procedures, and he began coordinating her diversion using terminology that confirmed he understood she had military background. But it was the F-22 pilots who provided the moment that would change everything. One of the Raptor pilots, flying somewhere in the airspace near her position though she could not see him because F-22s could operate invisibly to civilian radar, asked the controller for verification of who was in command of her aircraft. The controller started to read back her civilian name and flight number, but Sarah interrupted on the frequency using words she had not spoken in 7 years. She said her aircraft was under command of Ghost Rider, authenticating with tactical codes that she had memorized years ago and never forgotten. The radio went silent for 3 full seconds, a pause that stretched long enough to be noticeable even in the midst of a crisis situation. Then one of the F-22 pilots came back on the frequency with a voice that carried shock and something close to reverence, asking for confirmation that he had actually heard what he thought he heard. He said the call sign Ghost Rider using a tone that made it clear he knew exactly what that name represented and could not quite believe that the legendary pilot was commanding a civilian airliner full of passengers rather than flying combat missions in restricted airspace. The second F-22 pilot, who had been maintaining radio silence while his wingman handled communications, broke protocol to key his radio and say that every fighter pilot in the Navy knew the Ghost Rider stories, that her missions were taught in tactical schools as examples of perfect execution, and that having her on this frequency changed everything about how they were going to handle this crisis. The military controller, recognizing that something significant had just happened even if he did not fully understand the history behind the call sign, asked Sarah for her tactical assessment of the situation and what support she needed from the F-22s who were now explicitly assigned to escort and protect her aircraft. Sarah felt the years of civilian flying fall away as she shifted fully back into combat mode, her mind processing the tactical situation with the speed and clarity that had made her legendary in military aviation. She told the controller that she had multiple passengers who needed immediate medical attention, that her first officer was incapacitated though recovering, and that she needed priority clearance to the nearest field with full emergency services and security capabilities. She added that based on the pattern of failures across multiple aircraft, someone had developed a capability to interfere with commercial aircraft systems remotely, probably through cyber penetration of aircraft management systems, and that all civilian aircraft should be treated as potentially compromised until proven otherwise. The F-22 lead pilot, who had introduced himself using his call sign Blade, said his flight of 2 Raptors was positioning to provide close escort and would ensure no hostile aircraft or threats approached her position. He asked if she needed tactical support for any evasive maneuvers or defensive procedures, using language that assumed she would know how to execute combat aviation tactics if necessary. Sarah appreciated the confidence his question implied, the acknowledgement that Ghost Rider would be capable of flying defensive maneuvers in a civilian airliner if the situation required it, though she hoped it would not come to that given the limitations of a passenger jet compared to a fighter. The situation developed rapidly as Sarah coordinated with multiple agencies while hand-flying the 777 toward the military field that had been designated as her diversion point. Kevin had recovered enough to help with some cockpit duties, though he was clearly confused about why his captain was talking on military frequencies and being escorted by F-22s. The flight attendants were managing passenger anxiety as word spread through the cabin that fighter jets were visible outside the windows, sleek gray shapes that appeared and disappeared in the clouds as they maintained escort positions. Sarah made a careful announcement to the passengers, explaining that they had experienced a pressurization problem that required emergency descent and diversion, and that military aircraft were providing escort as a precautionary measure given the number of aircraft experiencing similar technical issues. What she did not tell the passengers was that 2 more aircraft had gone down in other parts of the country, not crashes but forced landings after pilots lost control of key systems, and that intelligence agencies were working frantically to identify who had developed the capability to remotely interfere with commercial aircraft and what their objectives might be. The F-22 pilots were providing information on their secure frequency that Sarah was monitoring, keeping her updated on the tactical picture in ways that helped her understand the broader situation. Blade told her that they were treating her aircraft as a high-value asset now that they knew Ghost Rider was in command, and that additional military resources were being positioned to ensure her safe landing. The approach to the military field was unlike anything Sarah had done in her 7 years of commercial flying but felt completely natural to someone with her background. The F-22 stayed in close formation, flying patterns that provided both escort and air superiority in case any hostile aircraft attempted to interfere with the landing. The field had been cleared of all other traffic, emergency vehicles were positioned along the runway, and security forces were establishing a perimeter to protect the aircraft once it landed. Sarah flew the approach with precision that came from hundreds of carrier landings in combat zones, putting the massive airliner down on the runway with barely a bump despite the crosswind and the stress of the situation. As the 777 rolled out and Sarah followed the ground controller's instructions to taxi to an isolated area where emergency crews and security forces were waiting, she could see the response being staged around her aircraft. Medical teams were ready to board and assess the passengers who had been affected by hypoxia, security personnel were establishing protocols to investigate possible tampering or cyber intrusion, and military commanders were coordinating the broader response to what was now being treated as a major national security incident. She shut down the engines and completed the post-landing checks with Kevin's help, then sat for a moment in the sudden silence of the cockpit. The flight attendants were managing passenger deplaning under the supervision of security forces who were treating everyone with professional courtesy while also conducting security screening. Kevin was being checked by medics who wanted to ensure he had suffered no lasting effects from his period of unconsciousness. And Sarah knew that as soon as she stepped out of the cockpit, her quiet existence as an anonymous commercial pilot was effectively over. The moment she had used her call sign on the military frequency, she had revealed the secret she had kept for 7 years, and there was no way to put that back in the box. The military commander who met her as she exited the aircraft was a full colonel who saluted her with obvious respect before extending his hand to shake hers. He said he had heard the Ghost Rider stories from Navy pilots who had served with her, that her reputation in the military aviation community was legendary, and that her decision to reveal her identity and take tactical command of the situation had probably saved her passengers' lives and provided crucial information about the nature of the attack. He asked if she would be willing to consult with the tactical response team who were trying to identify and counter whoever had developed the capability to interfere with commercial aircraft systems. Sarah agreed, though she knew that once she stepped into that briefing room, her return to military aviation circles would be complete regardless of what she decided to do afterward. The next several hours were intense as she provided detailed information about exactly what had happened to her aircraft, the specific symptoms she had observed, and the timeline of events that might help investigators understand the attack vector. The F-22 pilots, Blade and his wingman Torch, attended part of the briefing and made a point of introducing themselves to her formally, telling her it was an honor to fly escort for Ghost Rider and asking questions about some of her legendary missions that revealed how thoroughly her reputation had spread through military aviation communities. The investigation eventually revealed that a sophisticated cyber attack had targeted commercial aircraft systems, exploiting vulnerabilities in the wireless communication systems that modern airliners used for routine data transmission. The attackers had been able to send malicious code that gradually interfered with pressurization controls, causing the slow failures that had affected multiple aircraft. Sarah's rapid recognition of the problem and her decisive action to descend immediately had prevented her passengers from suffering serious harm, and her tactical assessment of the situation had helped authorities understand they were dealing with a coordinated attack rather than random mechanical failures. Several of the other affected aircraft had not been as fortunate, with injuries and even some fatalities resulting from pilots who had not recognized the subtle symptoms quickly enough. The media coverage of the incident focused initially on the mystery of the cyber attack and the military response, but as details emerged about the commercial pilot who had coordinated with F-22 fighters using tactical procedures and a legendary military call sign, reporters began investigating Sarah's background. The airline was shocked to discover that the captain they had considered completely conventional actually had one of the most distinguished combat records in naval aviation history. Her fellow pilots who had flown with her for years could not reconcile the quiet, professional woman they knew with the stories they were now hearing about impossible missions and legendary combat skills. Sarah found herself called to a meeting with airline senior management who wanted to understand why she had concealed her military background and whether her actions during the emergency had followed proper commercial aviation procedures. She explained calmly that her military service had been highly classified and that her transition to civilian aviation had required keeping that background confidential for security reasons. As for her emergency procedures, she had followed appropriate protocols for dealing with a pressurization emergency, and her communication with military forces had been necessary given the tactical nature of the threat. The fact that she had training beyond standard commercial requirements had only helped her handle the situation more effectively. The meeting concluded with management acknowledging that her actions had saved lives and prevented what could have been a catastrophic incident, though they were clearly still processing the revelation that one of their pilots had capabilities far beyond anything in typical commercial training. The pilots' union representative who attended the meeting pointed out that Sarah's additional training and experience should be viewed as an asset rather than a problem, and that the airline should be grateful to have pilots with such comprehensive skills rather than questioning why she had not advertised her background. But the real question Sarah had to answer was what came next for her. The military was interested in bringing her back in some capacity, possibly as an instructor or consultant given her unique combination of combat experience and recent commercial aviation work. The airline had made it clear she would continue to be welcome as a captain, though the dynamics of her relationships with colleagues had fundamentally changed now that everyone knew who Ghost Rider actually was. And she had to decide whether she wanted to return to the anonymity she had sought 7 years ago or embrace the recognition that came with her call sign and reputation. The F-22 pilots had given her a challenge coin before they departed back to their base, a small metal disc that carried the symbols of their squadron and a personal inscription thanking Ghost Rider for showing them what legendary flying looked like even in a civilian aircraft facing an impossible situation. Blade had told her that the younger fighter pilots needed to know that legends like her were real, that the stories they heard were not exaggerations but accurate accounts of what truly exceptional pilots could accomplish when training, skill and courage came together under pressure. He said she had a responsibility to share that knowledge and experience rather than hiding it away in commercial aviation where her full capabilities would never be needed. Sarah stood on the ramp at the military field where her 777 was still parked undergoing security inspection, watching the sun set over the mountains in the distance. She thought about the passengers she had saved, the crisis she had helped resolve, and the identity she had revealed after keeping it hidden for so long. She realized that trying to be anonymous had been her way of coping with the stress of her final classified mission, a way of creating distance from memories that were painful despite her professional pride in what she had accomplished. But the emergency had shown her that walking away from who she was did not actually change her fundamental nature or eliminate the skills that defined her as a pilot. She made her decision standing there on the ramp with the evening wind carrying the smell of jet fuel and the sound of military aircraft taking off in the distance. She would return to commercial flying because she genuinely enjoyed the work and appreciated the lower stress levels compared to combat operations, but she would no longer hide her background or downplay her capabilities. She would be Captain Sarah Mitchell, who happened to be the legendary Ghost Rider, someone who brought extraordinary skills to commercial aviation while also being available to help train the next generation of military pilots and consult on aviation security issues when needed. The airline passengers on her next flight 3 weeks later boarded the aircraft and saw a captain who looked exactly the same as before, professional and confident as she welcomed them aboard. But many of them had read the news stories about the commercial pilot with the legendary military background who had saved her passengers during a cyber attack, and some asked for autographs or thanked her for her service. Sarah handled the attention with grace, acknowledging her background when asked but focusing primarily on ensuring her passengers had a safe and comfortable flight. She knew her first officer on that flight and future flights would see her differently now, treating her not just as a more experienced pilot but as someone whose skills existed on a different level entirely. The real difference was inside her own mind, the acceptance that she could not separate herself from Ghost Rider because that call sign represented who she actually was at her core. She was a pilot who saw solutions that others missed, who remained calm in situations that would overwhelm most people, and who possessed skills that had been refined through years of training in combat operations that most pilots would never experience. Trying to pretend she was just another commercial pilot had been dishonest to herself and unfair to the people who depended on her expertise. She could be both the professional commercial captain who flew scheduled routes between cities and the legendary fighter pilot whose reputation made F-22 pilots sit up and take notice, because both roles drew on the same fundamental capabilities and commitment to excellence that defined her as an aviator. The F-22 pilots had understood that immediately when they heard her call sign on the radio, recognizing that someone with Ghost Rider's reputation would never stop being exceptional regardless of what aircraft she was flying or what uniform she was wearing. Their respect and reverence had not been for the military service itself but for the qualities that military service had revealed and refined in her, qualities that transferred perfectly well to handling commercial aviation emergencies when the situation required someone who could think tactically and execute precisely under impossible pressure. Sarah had saved 378 lives that day not because she had military training but because she was the kind of pilot who earned legendary call signs through consistent excellence, tactical brilliance, and unwavering commitment to completing the mission even when the odds said it was impossible. She flew her 777 through the evening sky toward her destination, thinking about how strange life could be, how the identity you tried to leave behind could come roaring back in the moment when it was needed most, and how sometimes the best way to honor your past was to integrate it with your present rather than keeping them separate. The passengers behind her were reading, sleeping, watching movies, trusting her to get them safely to their destination just as passengers always did. But now she knew that if they ever faced another crisis, another impossible situation that required something more than standard procedures and normal training, she would not hesitate to use every capability she possessed regardless of whether it seemed appropriate for a commercial pilot. She was Ghost Rider, and that meant she would do whatever was necessary to protect her passengers and complete her mission, just as she always had in the cockpit of a fighter jet or the flight deck of a massive airliner. The aircraft type and the uniform might change, but the pilot behind the call sign remained exactly who she had always been, someone who appeared when needed and executed the impossible with precision that made it look easy. That was what Ghost Rider meant, and she would carry that identity forward into whatever challenges came next, ready to handle them with the same legendary skill that had made F-22 pilots catch their breath in shock and reverence when they realized who was coordinating with them during that emergency flight that changed everything.